Welcome explorers today. Dive into this thrilling TTP narration of Ghosts in the Avalanche by Banancake, an ongoing fan-made book from the Nature of Predators series by Spacepaladin15 on r/HFY.
Memory transcription subject, Vickery, the honey badger. Date, standardized human time May 17, 2137. Chapter 7, the day they attacked. My eyes fluttered open as the car eased to a halt just outside my house. I lifted my head off of the window and rubbed my face, fur matted down from being pressed against the window for so long. The sun had gone down, revealing a starry sky above the quiet fields. "Morning, sleepyhead," Andy said softly. "This is your stop." I wearily rubbed one of my eyes and looked at Viv in the back seat. She was still out cold. Andy snickered. "Looks like you had a nice nap." I chuffed. "Yeah. And it looks like Viv is still having one." Andy began opening the door. "I'll help you get her inside." I opened my door. "No, it's fine, I got her." Andy shut her door back and giggled. "All right, big bro." I shook my head, opened the rear door, and reached inside to undo Vivri's seatbelt. She stirred slightly in response. I worked my arms under her and heaved as I lifted her out of the seat. Andy grabbed the steering wheel. "So, who is the oldest?" she asked. I began walking toward the house before I looked over my shoulder at Andy. "She is. By like 5 minutes. Vivri mumbled, half asleep. Andy laughed as she put the car in gear. "Well, take care of big sis, then, Vic. Take care of yourself too, get some sleep." "I will," I assured her. "See you tomorrow." "See you tomorrow, neighbor." The engine rumbled as Andy took off down the road to put the car back into the garage. I struggled to get up the stairs with Vivri in my arms before I heard a strange sound. My ears perked up as it seemed to emanate from all around me. It was quiet but high-pitched, ringing in my ears for a few seconds. It seemed to echo from the fields around me. At the same time, I felt Vivri flinch, and I heard what sounded like wood splitting from behind me just a fraction of a second later. Confused, I wheeled around to see where the sound had come from. Across the road, a wooden fence post was missing a large chunk of its base. A small trail of smoke rose out of the new cavity on its surface as a small fire began to spread around it. Splintered timber was scattered on the ground next to it, glowing red like embers. I looked around frantically, ears raised to full alert, before I felt Vivri stop breathing. I pinned my back against the house and shook her slightly. "Vivri! Hey!" She was completely limp. Below her, I could see blood beginning to pool and the wooden surface of the porch. My eyes went wide as I set her down. "Vivri?" I moved her arms to reveal a small hole in her upper chest, slowly leaking blood into her fur. I gasped raggedly before pressing my paws over her chest. "Viv! Vivri! Can you?" I began panting. "Oh fuck." Panicking, I whistled loudly for Lucky. I knew she could get out of the barn on her own if she needed to now. I grabbed Vivri's face. "Hey! Vivri!" I panted as I opened her eyelids. No movement. My voice cracked as the adrenaline only increased, and tears started streaking down my face. "Come on, sis." I looked to the barn. No sign of Lucky. "Lucky!" I shouted. Nothing. I stood up, cupping my paws over my mouth. "Lucky!" I wasn't sure why calling Lucky was my first instinct. Maybe I wanted to know if she was all right. Maybe I thought she could get help. It didn't matter. She wasn't responding. I frantically tapped on my watch to call the police, but as I hit the call button, I heard the same silvery, high-pitched sound and felt my body jolt. My legs went numb as I flopped backward next to Vivri. I clenched my teeth as a voice answered my call in my translator. 911, what's your emergency?" I wheezed. Shooting, horseshoe flat. I strained to lift my head, and down the road, concealed in the shadows, I could see a figure moving toward me. Suddenly, none of the pain or numbness mattered. My body seemed to move on its own as I stumbled to my feet and began clumsily running toward the figure. "I'll fucking kill you!" I shrieked as I charged forward with little thought for my own safety. Suddenly, I was hit again. This time, I wasn't getting up. I was ruthlessly thrown to the dirt. My vision darkened as I struggled to breathe. I felt weightless. I heard footsteps in the gravel as a shadow loomed over me, staring down at me with piercing, white eyes. My last act before my vision faded away was reaching out toward the figure, claws extended, as the moon glowed brightly behind it. "Vic!" I gasped for air, feeling gravity take hold of my tensed body once more. The moon was replaced by bright, white lights that streaked across my vision as tears poured out of my eyes. I could hear the faint sound of upbeat, human pop music playing over a PA system as I panted. I relaxed my body, letting go of something with my claws. I looked down to see a pair of human arms wrapped tightly around my waist and chest. They were covered in shallow claw marks, and as I released my grip fully, I saw that my claws had dug deep into the skin. My once vibrant, yellow claws were now coated in a dark layer of red. I heard Andy's voice behind me. "You awake?" she asked somewhat urgently. Her grip on me loosened. Realizing what had happened, I scrambled out of her grasp, my heart still racing. Turning around, I could see Andy's arms covered in shallow cuts. Thin streaks of blood ran down her forearm as she quickly wiped tears out of her eyes. I stood there for a second, stunned, before I placed my paws on my head, panting. Did I? "It's nothing, Vic," she sniffled. "Takes a lot more than that to hurt a big, strong predator like me," she chuckled, still wiping her face with the back of her wrists. I started wheezing as my breathing picked up pace. She was hurt. And I caused it. I started walking backward as the world in front of me stretched in a blur. You. "Vic, it's okay," Andy said in a breathy tone. "Calm down." My backpedaling became faster as I felt a sickening rush to my head. Andy put out a hand. "Vic, don't," it was too late. I bolted in a random direction. I had no idea where I was or where I would go, but something in my head forced me to run. The exact reason was unclear, but I thought that maybe I didn't want to see what I'd done to Andy. I wanted to get as far away as possible. The world around me turned to little more than streaks of light and muffled sounds as my own heartbeat pounded in my ears. As I ran, my paws met the rougher pavement of a road. A blaring horn hurled me back into lucidity. Time seemed to slow down as I looked to my left and saw a bright pair of headlights bearing down on me. An icy chill ran down my spine, crackling through my limbs. I was frozen. There was nothing I could do. I suddenly felt a tight grip on the back of my neck as I was flung backward with incredible force. My legs lifted off the ground completely, following after my upper body as I was pulled through the air and out of harm's way with just a fraction of a second to spare. I felt a massive gust of wind as a truck flew by, and I collided with Andy on the ground. The sound of the autonomous semi faded in the distance as I sat there on the pavement, panting. Andy released me and leaned back on her hands, looking up at the sky as she breathed heavily. A long few seconds of silence followed before she said anything. "God damn," she exhaled. "Are you actually awake now?" "Wait, where's Vivri?" I asked desperately. "She's conked out in the car. She's fine." Andy placed a hand over her chest as she calmed her breathing. I swallowed a breath before shaking my head. "I'm so sorry," I whimpered. "I almost." "But you didn't." "It's fine, Vic," Andy sighed. "I hurt you though." "You didn't," she said plainly. "You started thrashing around in the car, so I stopped here and got you out. Then you started trying to run away, so I held you in place. I could hardly tell if you were sleeping or not. I knew you'd probably scratch me up, but I held on anyway. You didn't hurt me, Vic. Don't worry about it." She inspected her forearms as she crossed her legs next to me. "I've had cats do worse." Then why were you crying? I asked, looking over at her. Andy rubbed her eyes and sniffled as she looked down. Because I know what that's like. I stared over at her for a few seconds. The silence of the desolate gas station replaced the desperation of my own heartbeat in my head. You do? Andy snickered, flashing her teeth briefly before looking over at me. You really think you're that alone? She fidgeted with her hands as she looked back at the ground, curly hair hanging over her eye. I don't know that there's any human alive that wasn't falling apart after the attack. I pulled my legs in. Yeah. I think about that day all the time. Andy sighed. So do I. She took a moment before leaning back and looking over at me. Well, come on, I know you're curious to know what happened. I wasn't going to ask. I don't like talking about that stuff, so Neither do I. But it'll make you feel a lot better. After all that, the only way we're gonna heal is by sharing each other's burdens. I rubbed under one of my eyes. I don't want to put that burden on you, though. I hardly know you, what right do I? That's the funny thing about burdens, Andy interrupted. The more hands you have on it, the lighter it gets. Don't need to know each other to care, that's what empathy is. She scoffed. And you know that old English thing my dad says. Ha, love thy neighbor as thyself, Andy said in a mock accent. She giggled before returning to a more serious tone. Come on. I tell you, you tell me. Clearly, it's becoming too much for you to handle alone. I sealed my mouth shut and squinted at her slightly as she returned my gaze. Lighter lines on her face were visible where her tears had washed away her makeup. The cuts on her arms had already stopped bleeding. She didn't even seem to feel them. I couldn't fathom why she would do what she did. To let me harm her to keep me from danger, and shed tears for me while she did it. I was perplexed, but I could see that she truly cared. The least I could do was try. I took a deep breath. Okay. I'll try. That's all I ask, Andy muttered. She inhaled sharply. I figured something was up when Vivri mentioned you having nightmares that day. I had them a lot not too long ago. She crossed her arms over her lap. The day they attacked, my mom was in the ER. Internal bleeding, never figured out exactly why. We knew the attack was coming, but she needed surgery. It couldn't wait. Surgery went okay, but she got out not long before the bombs started falling. Things looked bleak for her. She wasn't waking up, so they put her on a ventilator until they could figure out what was wrong, but, obviously, priorities shifted. Andy rubbed her nose and shifted slightly, looking over at me to see if I was listening. I'd turned my body toward her and was listening to every word. She looked back out at the horizon. I remember watching the news and seeing live footage from the ground. I watched Toronto get erased from existence in the blink of an eye. The power went out right on cue, and the generators kicked in. I remember hearing that drone from right below us and knowing that was the only thing keeping my mom alive. Another vehicle whipped by, sending a breeze washing over us that ruffled Andy's hair as she brushed it out of her face. We stayed there for days, hoping those street lamps outside would come back on. One day, I was down in the lobby looking for something to eat while they were bringing in the fuel containers. And this desperate-looking guy walks through the doors. He had a gun in his hand, and he was sobbing his eyes out. He fired a shot into the ceiling and told everyone to get down. My ears lowered as I shook my head, perplexed. Why? What did he want? Andy shook her head. Insulin. His daughter was a diabetic. She was dying. My mouth hung open slightly before I swallowed. That's... Yeah. It happened everywhere. The supply chain was ruined. No, not ruined, it didn't exist anymore. Insulin was like diamonds in those few weeks after the battle. No one knew how long it would be before someone could bring them more. And it wasn't like the Arxer or Zeruleans had a bunch on hand. People were killing each other over it. Andy rubbed her forehead and inhaled deeply. I guess all the pharmacies were out because this guy held the whole place hostage for it. He started demanding someone give him insulin, but there were kids in there who needed it too. This guy must have gotten the impression he wouldn't be finding it anywhere else because he wanted way more than a dose. He grabbed one of the nurses and threatened to kill her if he didn't get what he wanted. Staff tried talking some sense into him, but he'd just lost it completely. Andy shook her head as she looked down. One of the men there, probably a patient's father, pulled a gun and shot the guy right in front of me. Andy pursed her lips. And he probably killed his daughter by extension. I looked down. I don't even have the words for that. Yeah. It wasn't pretty. The guy just wanted his daughter to live. Got a little too desperate. Andy sighed. Later on, the drive section of a ship crashed down nearby, and the EMP fried everything. Power went out for the last time. My mom still wasn't awake. For hours afterward, the nurses kept her breathing with a bag. They taught my dad and me how to do it so we could take over while they were needed elsewhere. At some point, her heart stopped. Probably would have happened with or without the ventilator, but I took my mom's last breath for her. The sparsely scattered trees surrounding the gas station ruffled as a shallow breeze passed by, rolling down the highway as it whistled in the weeds. I took a moment to take in everything Andy had said. I'm sorry. I wish I could have done more. If what I hear is true, you did plenty, Andy nudged me. I shook my head. I don't know what you've heard, but it probably isn't all it's been blown up to be. Andy turned her body toward me. So tell me. Well, it's kind of a long story. Well then, just tell me what's bothering you. Andy propped her head up on her fist. I took a deep breath. I guess do you ever look in the mirror and see someone you don't recognize? Saying you don't recognize yourself? Yeah, I guess so. I rubbed my paws together. I saw and did some things I never thought I would. And I feel like it changed me, and I guess I'm afraid of that. Change is a scary thing, Andy sighed. Everyone's whole world changed after that day. You certainly aren't alone there. Yeah, but my throat started closing up. I killed someone, Andy. Andy's face seemed to droop in a mix of surprise and worry. On the destroyer, she muttered. Yeah, I wiped under my eyes. Crocodile soldier. Shot him dead. Me, a cowardly Venlil, I scoffed. I grew up with some crocodile. Even had a pretty good friend in school that was from Nishtal. And I didn't hesitate. I tapped into a side of me that I didn't know existed several times that day, and it still scares the fuck out of me, I choked. And I can't help but wonder what Tengo would think if he saw me like that. I've heard that name, who was he? I shook my head. I don't think I'm ready to talk about all that. Andy nodded. All right. Well, Vic, what you're experiencing, it's not gonna fix itself. I can't say I know what it's like to kill someone, but there are people out there who do. I know you're afraid of who you might have changed into, but I see a brave and caring person from where I'm sitting. First Venlil to own a dog, she laughed. Whatever you've done, you don't deserve to suffer like this, she said in a softer, slightly broken tone. She stared at me for a second, waiting for a reply before she pulled out her phone. Here, give me your paw. What? Just do it, she narrowed her eyes down at me slightly. I hesitantly handed her my paw. She took me by the wrist and turned my palm downward as she began swiping through my watch. I do know what it's like to have nightmares like that. To be haunted by that stuff. She scrolled to my contacts and entered a number. I'm giving you the number of a guy who helped me through that. Name's Isaac Rayner. He's a therapist. A damn good one at that. She sighed. I don't know what he can do for insomnia, seeing as drugs for Venlil aren't exactly abundant around here. She finished putting in the number and released my wrist. But he's a damn good listener, Vic. He's helped a lot of people just like you. Our biology might be different, but our feelings are the same. Just try, okay? Promise? I took a deep breath, rubbing the remnants of tears out of the fur around my eyes. All right, I whispered. I want to hear you say it, Andy muttered. I nodded. I'll try. The drive home was quiet. For most of it, I watched passing lights and gazed up at the moon while my mind danced about. When we got home, I put Vivri to bed. I can't say that my heart didn't race once I stepped out of the car. It all seemed too familiar. I knew it was just a nightmare, but everything looked the exact same as it did in my dream. Who could say I wasn't dreaming now? I lay on my sheets, staring at the ceiling in an odd reality between asleep and awake. Shapes and colors formed in my vision, floating about in the dark room without any clear figure. Several times, I shook my head as it felt like my body was becoming weightless, and those shapes started to take form. Usually as faces, though they were too abstract for me to recognize them. I stared at the number on my watch as the sun rose, climbing my blinds one thin sliver at a time. My vision warped and bent as I stared at my watch. My body felt heavy. My thoughts were cloudy and formless. Andy was right, I couldn't take much more of this. If I were to call this number right now, what would I say? I contemplated this for a while before the screen suddenly shifted on the watch face, and I jumped slightly. The device vibrated as a number that I hadn't seen in months appeared on the screen.